Don't howl. Omega saved Alpha King after sensing something no one else could. The crimson dawn painted the forest in shades of warning, but nobody seemed to notice except Arya. She stumbled over another root, her worn leather boots barely gripping the dew-slicked ground as she struggled to keep pace with the hunting party. The supply pack on her shoulders felt heavier with each step, filled with emergency medical supplies, extra arrows, and dried meat that would probably go untouched. Alpha King Kale's hunting parties never lasted long enough to need provisions. His kills were swift, brutal, and absolute. Stay invisible, she reminded herself, the same mantra that had kept her alive for 22 years in the Silver Moon Pack. Invisible Omegas live longer. The forest around them pulsed with an energy that made her wolf whimper restlessly beneath her skin. Ancient pines stretched toward the bleeding sky, their branches heavy with morning mist that seemed to cling too long, moved too strangely. Something felt wrong, but then again something always felt wrong to Arya. That was her curse or gift depending on who you asked. Most days she considered it a curse. Ahead of her, 30 of the pack's finest warriors moved through the underbrush with predatory grace. Their muscles rippled beneath torn shirts and leather vests, bodies built for violence and dominance. Beta Fenric led the group just behind King Kale, his blonde hair catching the strange light as he whispered something that made several warriors chuckle darkly. But it was Kale who commanded every eye, every breath, every heartbeat in the forest. The Alpha King stood 6'4" of pure dominance, his black hair tousled from the morning run, green eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Even in his human form, power radiated from him like heat from a forge. His presence was so overwhelming that smaller pack members like Arya instinctively lowered their gazes when he passed. She'd only looked directly at him once, 3 years ago, and the memory of his piercing stare still made her stomach flutter with a mixture of fear and something she refused to name. Positions. Fenric's voice cracked through the morning air. The hunting party spread out in a perfect formation they'd practiced countless times. Arya quickly moved to her designated spot, 30 feet behind the main group, close enough to provide supplies if needed, far enough away to avoid interfering with the hunt. She set down her pack and tried to blend into the shadow of a massive oak tree, its bark rough against her back. King Kale stepped into a small clearing where rays of red sunlight pierced the canopy. This was it, the moment every pack member had been anticipating. The hunt's call, an ancient ritual where the Alpha's howl would echo through the territory, announcing the pack's presence to any rogues or rival packs foolish enough to trespass on Silver Moon land. Arya had witnessed this ceremony dozens of times, but today something was different. The air itself felt thick, oppressive, like the moments before a violent storm. Her enhanced senses, the genetic quirk that made her valuable enough to keep alive despite her low rank, were screaming warnings that no one else could hear. The metallic tang hit her nostrils like a physical blow. Blood, but not the warm, rich scent of a fresh kill. This was different, sharp, chemical, wrong. It carried undertones of silver and something else, something that made her wolf pace frantically in her mind. Poison. The realization slammed into her with crystal clarity, just as King Kale tilted his head back, his throat working as he prepared to release the howl that would shake the forest. In 3 seconds, his voice would carry for miles. In 3 seconds, every enemy within a 50-mile radius would know exactly where he stood. And in 3 seconds, he would die. Arya didn't think. Thinking was for pack members who had the luxury of rank, of protection, of knowing their actions wouldn't result in immediate execution. She simply moved. Her legs carried her forward with a speed that surprised even her, her Omega instincts for once working with her instead of against her. The warriors turned in shock as she burst from the tree-line, their hands moving instinctively to weapons. "Don't," she started, but her voice caught in her throat as King Kale's blazing green eyes locked onto hers. Time slowed. She could see the exact moment his lips parted, could see the breath filling his lungs, could see death approaching in the form of a ritual that had protected their pack for generations. Her hand shot out without permission from her brain. fingers wrapping around his wrist with desperate strength. "Don't howl," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 warriors stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to murderous rage. An Omega had just touched the Alpha King. An Omega had just interrupted the most sacred ceremony of their pack. An Omega had just signed her own death warrant. But King Kale didn't pull away. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her knees weak, and for one impossible moment, she saw something that looked almost like recognition in his gaze. Then the world exploded. Arrows rained from the canopy like deadly silver rain, each tip gleaming with a substance that made the air shimmer with toxicity. They struck the ground exactly where King Kale had been standing, exactly where his howl would have anchored him for those few vulnerable seconds. "Ambush!" Fenric roared, his voice cutting through the chaos as warriors dove for cover. Arya found herself pressed against King Kale's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her as they rolled behind a fallen log. His body was a wall of heat and muscle and barely contained violence, and she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. The scent of his skin, pine and leather and something uniquely, dangerously him, filled her senses and made her wolf purr with contentment even as death whispered overhead. More arrows thudded into the log above them, each impact sending splinters raining down. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the warriors fighting back. The sound of shifting bones and snarling wolves mixing with human shouts and the twang of bowstrings. "How did you know?" King Kale's voice was rough, barely controlled, his breath warm against her ear. Arya's mind reeled. How could she explain that she'd smelled death on the wind? That her freakish senses had detected poison from 100 yards away? That every instinct she possessed had screamed warnings that no normal wolf would ever hear? I smelled something wrong," she whispered, knowing how insane it sounded. His arms tightened around her fractionally. "What did you smell?" "Silver. Poison." And she hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "And betrayal." King Kale went very, very still. The sounds of battle were already fading as the attackers melted back into the forest. Their mission failed. Soon the warriors would regroup, and questions would be asked. Questions she couldn't answer without revealing just how different she truly was. Questions that would probably get her killed anyway. But as King Kale's green eyes studied her face with an expression she couldn't read, Arya realized that staying invisible was no longer an option. For better or worse, she had just stepped into the light. And in the world of wolves, the light was the most dangerous place to be. The silence after the arrows stopped falling felt more dangerous than the attack itself. Arya remained pressed against King Kale's chest, acutely aware that every second she stayed in his protective embrace was another nail in her coffin. But his arms hadn't loosened their hold, and she found herself frozen by the solid reality of his presence. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of cedar and dominance that clung to his skin. "Clear!" The shout came from somewhere in the canopy, followed by the heavy thud of boots, hitting ground as scouts confirmed the attackers had vanished. The moment the all-clear sounded, King Kale's arms fell away from her, and the sudden absence of his warmth left Arya feeling exposed and vulnerable. She scrambled backward, putting distance between them while keeping her eyes downcast, but she could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes boring into her. The warriors emerged from their cover like predators scenting blood, and she was the prey. What the hell was that? The voice belonged to Marcus, a broad-shouldered gamma whose scars spoke of countless battles. His brown eyes were fixed on Arya with undisguised suspicion. "Since when does an Omega give orders to the Alpha King?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Arya's stomach clenched. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like an avalanche. In the world of werewolves, hierarchy was everything, and she had just shattered every rule that kept their society functioning. Beta Fenric stepped forward, his blonde hair catching the strange morning light as his blue eyes narrowed to icy slits. Where King Kale radiated controlled power, Fenric buzzed with barely contained aggression. A man who'd clawed his way to the second highest position in the pack and wasn't about to let anyone forget it. "I'll tell you what that was," Fenric said, his voice carrying easily through the clearing. "That was a traitor showing her true colors." The words hit Arya like physical blows. Around the clearing, warriors who had been murmuring amongst themselves fell silent, their attention sharpening to a deadly focus. "Think about it," Fenric continued, beginning to pace in a slow circle that kept Arya at its center. How did she know exactly when to interfere? How did she know where the arrows would fall? Why would a lowly Omega risk her life to touch the Alpha King unless she already knew what was coming? "That's not," Arya started, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Speak up," Fenric snapped. "If you're innocent, then explain yourself. Tell us how a servant who spends her days scrubbing floors and washing dishes suddenly developed tactical awareness that surpassed 30 trained warriors." Heat flooded Arya's cheeks as more warriors nodded in agreement. She could see the logic in their suspicion. From the outside, her actions must have looked impossibly convenient. How could she explain that she'd smelled death on the wind when none of them had detected anything unusual? "She's right, though," interrupted Thomas, a younger warrior with kind eyes who'd always treated the Omega servants with basic respect. "The arrows fell exactly where the king would have been standing. If she was working with the attackers, why would she save him?" Fenric's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Because the ambush failed, obviously. Maybe the plan was to make it look like she saved him to gain his trust. What better way to get close to our Alpha than to play the role of devoted protector?" King Kale had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Arya could feel his gaze on her like a physical weight. When she finally dared to glance up, his green eyes were unreadable, measuring. The sight of his perfectly controlled expression made something twist painfully in her chest. "Enough!" King Kale's voice cut through the discussion like a blade, instantly silencing every warrior in the clearing. The single word carried such absolute authority that even Fenric took an involuntary step backward. But when the Alpha King's gaze settled on Arya, she saw something that made her blood run cold: doubt. Not the murderous certainty of the other warriors, but the careful, analytical doubt of a leader who couldn't afford to make mistakes. "Explain yourself," he said quietly, and somehow his calm tone was more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "How did you know?" Arya's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment where she either revealed the truth about her abilities or died trying to convince them of a lie. Neither option seemed likely to end well. "I smelled something wrong in the air," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite every instinct that screamed at her to submit. "Something metallic and sharp. It made my wolf restless." "Silver," Marcus said slowly. "The arrows were silver-tipped." "Exactly," Fenric interjected with a triumphant expression. "She smelled silver because she knew it was coming. No wolf can detect silver at that distance, especially not an Omega." "But what if she can?" Thomas asked quietly. "What if her senses are stronger than normal?" The suggestion sent another ripple of unease through the group. Enhanced senses in an Omega weren't unheard of, but they were rare enough to be viewed with deep suspicion. In a world where power determined survival, any advantage held by the lowest-ranking pack member was seen as an aberration of nature. "Prove it," King Kale said suddenly, his voice cutting through the debate. Arya blinked. "What?" "If your senses are truly enhanced, prove it," he gestured toward the forest. "Tell me what you smell, what you hear that we cannot." The clearing fell silent except for the whisper of wind through leaves. Arya closed her eyes and let her consciousness expand, reaching out with senses that had always made her different, always made her a target. The forest came alive in ways the others would never experience. She could smell the lingering fear sweat of the attackers, could detect the faint trail they'd left heading northeast. There was wolf scent but also something else, something human that didn't belong in their territory. "The attackers went northeast," she said, her voice growing stronger as confidence built. 3 werewolves and 2 humans. One of the humans is injured. I can smell blood that's not ours. And she hesitated, then forced herself to continue. One of the werewolves has been in our territory before. Recently. Several warriors exchanged sharp glances. If what she said was true, it meant they had a security breach far more serious than a random ambush. Fenric's expression had darkened considerably. Convenient details that anyone could guess. But King Kale was studying her with renewed intensity, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of something that might have been respect. Marcus, take a team northeast. Follow the trail and report back what you find. Alpha, Fenric said carefully. Surely you're not going to trust the word of. I'm going to trust the evidence. King Kale cut him off. Then his gaze returned to Arya, and she saw the decision forming behind his eyes. You'll return to the palace. Under guard. The word sent a chill through her. Under guard could mean protection, but it could just as easily mean imprisonment while they decided her fate. Alpha, Fenric pressed. If she is a traitor, then she'll be dealt with accordingly, King Kale said with finality. But she saved my life today, whether by design or chance. That earns her the right to a proper investigation, not a battlefield execution. As the hunting party began to reorganize for the journey back, Arya found herself flanked by 2 warriors whose expressions made it clear they considered her guilty until proven otherwise. But as they started toward home, she caught King Kale watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. She'd bought herself time, but she could feel the noose of suspicion tightening around her neck with every step. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible certainty was beginning to form. The betrayal she'd smelled on the wind hadn't come from outside the pack. It had come from within. The Silvermoon Pack's palace rose from the heart of their territory like a fortress carved from moonlight and shadow. Built from local granite and timber, it commanded respect while blending seamlessly with the ancient forests that surrounded it. Arya had lived within its walls for over a decade, but she'd never entered the Alpha King's private study, a sanctuary reserved for pack leadership and matters of life and death. Today she qualified for both categories. The room was exactly what she'd expected from King Kale. Functional elegance without excess. Dark leather furniture, shelves lined with books on pack law and military strategy, weapons mounted on walls that had witnessed countless crucial decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the training grounds where warriors honed their skills in both human and wolf forms. But what struck her most was how his scent permeated every surface, cedar and dominance and something uniquely him that made her wolf pace restlessly. Sit, King Kale said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his massive oak desk. Arya perched on the edge of the seat, her spine rigid with tension. The 2 guards who'd escorted her from the forest remained stationed outside, close enough to intervene if she proved to be the threat everyone suspected. Through the thick door, she could hear the low murmur of pack business continuing. A reminder that the world hadn't stopped spinning just because her life hung in the balance. King Kale settled into his own chair with predatory grace, his green eyes never leaving her face. Without his usual retinue of advisors and warriors, he seemed both more approachable and infinitely more dangerous. Here in his domain there was nowhere to hide. Tell me about your senses, he said without preamble. Arya's fingers twisted in her lap. What do you want to know? Everything. When did they first manifest? How strong are they? Why haven't you reported this ability to pack leadership? The questions came rapid fire, each one highlighting how badly she'd violated pack protocol by staying silent. Enhanced abilities were supposed to be reported immediately. They could determine everything from rank assignment to mating prospects to specialized duties within the pack structure. They've always been this way, she said quietly. Even as a child, I could smell things others couldn't, hear conversations from across the compound, tell when someone was lying just by their scent changes. And you never thought this information might be valuable to your pack. Heat flushed her cheeks. I learned early that being different made me a target. Other Omega children called me a freak. Their parents whispered that I was cursed, unnatural. When I started working in the kitchens at 14, the cook told me that strange Omegas who drew attention usually ended up dead or exiled. Something flickered across King Kale's expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. So you hid. I survived, she corrected, surprised by the edge in her own voice. In your pack, survival isn't guaranteed for anyone below Gamma rank. A long silence stretched between them. When King Kale finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Show me. Show you what? Your abilities. If they're real, prove it. Arya nodded, having expected this moment. King Kale rose from his desk and moved to a cabinet across the room, retrieving several small objects that he arranged on the surface without letting her see them clearly. Tell me what I'm holding, he said, standing with his back to her while blocking her view. She closed her eyes and let her enhanced senses expand. A silver coin old maybe a century. There's blood on it, but it's ancient, not fresh. And she paused, concentrating. Sage. Someone burned sage near that coin recently. King Kale's shoulders tensed slightly. He set down the first object and picked up another. This. A letter. The paper is expensive, handmade. It was written by a woman. Her perfume is still faint on the fibers. Lavender and something else. Roses, maybe. She was upset when she wrote it. Fear sweat mixed with the floral scents. And this. A weapon. Small blade recently sharpened. The metal has been blessed by a pack shaman. I can smell the ritual oils. But there's also, she frowned, her wolf growing agitated. Betrayal. Whoever last held that blade was planning to use it against someone they claimed to serve. The silence that followed felt electric with tension. When King Kale finally turned around, his face was carved from granite, but his eyes burned with something that might have been anger or fear. The coin belonged to my father, he said slowly. It was found clutched in his hand when he died 20 years ago. The blood you smell is his. The sage was burned during his funeral rites last month when we moved his remains to the new mausoleum. Arya's breath caught. Alpha King Magnus had been killed in battle against rogues when Kale was barely 18. A tragedy that had shaped the current king's entire reign. The letter was from my mother to my father, written the day before he died. She begged him not to ride out against the rogues because she'd had prophetic dreams about his death. And the blade, his voice grew deadly quiet. The blade belongs to my beta. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Fenric's weapon, tainted with the scent of betrayal. The perfectly timed ambush that morning. The way he'd been so quick to accuse her of treachery, as if deflecting suspicion from himself. You think Beta Fenric is working against you, she said, the words barely a whisper. I think someone in my inner circle set up today's attack, King Kale replied, moving back to his desk with controlled precision. The timing was too perfect, the positioning too exact. Only 5 people knew the exact location where I planned to perform the hunt's call. Fenric was one of them. Who were the others? Marcus Thomas, my head of security, and his jaw tightened. My mate's brother, Derek. Arya felt her heart stutter. Mate. Of course the Alpha King had a mate. Probably some beautiful, high-ranking female who embodied everything Arya could never be. The reminder of her place in the pack hierarchy hit harder than it should have. Does your mate know about your suspicions? She asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Something dark flickered across King Kale's face. My mate is dead. Killed in a hunting accident 6 months ago. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and implications. 6 months wasn't long enough to properly mourn a mate bond, especially for an alpha. And if Derek was the mate's brother. Derek blamed you for her death, she said, understanding beginning to dawn. Among others. Luna Sarah died when her horse spooked during a hunt I organized. Derek has made no secret of his belief that I failed to protect her. King Kale's voice remained level, but she could smell the pain beneath his controlled exterior. But planning my assassination would be treason of the highest order. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Enter," King Howl called. Marcus stepped inside, his expression grim. "Alpha, we followed the trail northeast as ordered. Found evidence of the 5 attackers exactly as Arya described, 3 wolves, 2 humans, 1 injured. But there's more. Report. We found this at their campsite." Marcus held up a piece of torn fabric. "It's from a Silver Moon Pack uniform. Beta rank insignia." The silence that followed was deafening. Arya's enhanced senses picked up the sudden spike in King Howl's scent. Anger and betrayal mixing with something that smelled like deadly resolve. "Dismissed," King Howl said quietly. After Marcus left, the Alpha King turned back to Arya with an expression that made her wolf whimper. "It seems your nose has uncovered more than just an ambush. The question now is whether you're prepared to help me catch a traitor." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Confident, approaching quickly. Fenric's voice carried through the door as he spoke to the guards, asking permission to enter. King Howl's eyes met hers across the desk, and in that moment, she realized her life had just become infinitely more dangerous. She'd stumbled into a conspiracy that went to the very heart of Pack leadership, and now the prime suspect was about to walk through the door. "Remember," King Howl said quietly as Fenric's footsteps grew closer, "in the world of wolves, the most dangerous predator is always the one you trust." The door opened and Beta Fenric stepped inside with his trademark confident smile. A smile that no longer looked quite as friendly as it once had. "Alpha," Fenric said as he entered, his blue eyes immediately finding Arya with barely concealed contempt. "I trust the Omega has been properly questioned about this morning's incident." King Howl's expression remained neutral, but Arya caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. She has been cooperative. Her information proved accurate. "How fortunate," Fenric replied, though his tone suggested he found it anything but fortunate. "The council is requesting an immediate meeting about security protocols. We can't have servants interfering with Pack ceremonies, regardless of their intentions." "The council will wait," King Howl said firmly. "I have more pressing matters to attend to." Fenric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Alpha. But perhaps the Omega should return to her duties while we discuss Pack business." "Arya stays." The 2 words carried absolute finality, and Arya saw something flicker across Fenric's face. Surprise, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. "As you wish," Fenric said carefully, "though I should warn you that keeping her close is causing talk among the Pack." After Fenric left, King Howl turned to Arya with an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been apology. "I'm assigning you as my personal aide, effective immediately. You'll attend all meetings, accompany me to Pack functions, and stay within the palace walls unless I'm with you." Arya's heart lurched. "Alpha, I don't understand. Your senses saved my life once. I intend to make sure they can do so again." His green eyes met hers steadily. "And it will keep you safe while we investigate who's trying to kill me." But safe was the last thing Arya felt over the following weeks. Her new position as the Alpha King's personal aide placed her in a world she'd never been meant to enter. She attended strategy meetings where high-ranking wolves discussed territory disputes and trade agreements, stood at King Howl's shoulder during court sessions where he settled Pack disputes, and accompanied him on official visits to neighboring territories. And at every turn her enhanced senses proved invaluable. 3 days after the forest ambush, she smelled poison on King Howl's evening meal and switched their plates before he could take a bite. The kitchen servant who'd prepared it was found dead in her quarters the next morning, an apparent suicide, though the scent of fear that lingered in the room told a different story. A week later, during a meeting with the Alpha of the neighboring Crescent Moon Pack, she detected the scent of silver concealed beneath diplomatic gifts. The supposedly ceremonial dagger presented as a gesture of goodwill was laced with enough silver dust to cause serious harm to any werewolf who handled it carelessly. Then came the incident during the new moon ceremony. As King Kale prepared to light the sacred fire, Arya's wolf began pacing frantically. The smell of accelerant, gasoline mixed with something more volatile, made her grab his wrist just as he lowered the torch. The explosion that followed would have killed him instantly if he'd been standing 2 feet closer. Each time the pack whispered a little louder. "She's a witch," Arya overheard one of the Gamma females saying in the kitchen. "No Omega has senses that strong. She's using dark magic to manipulate the Alpha. Did you see how she touched him during the ceremony?" Another voice added. Bold as brass, laying hands on the Alpha King like she had the right. "It's unnatural." But it was the female voices that worried Arya most. The high-ranking she-wolves who'd once vied for King Kale's attention, and now saw her as an unwelcome obstacle. Lady Victoria, a stunning beta female with glossy auburn hair and amber eyes, made her displeasure particularly clear. During a formal dinner, she approached Arya with a smile that never reached her eyes. "How fascinating that a kitchen servant has become so indispensable to our Alpha," Victoria said, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby wolves to hear. "Tell me, Arya, may I call you Arya? What exactly do you do to help the king relax after his duties?" The implication in her words made Arya's cheeks burn, but before she could respond, King Kale appeared at her side. "Lady Victoria," he said coolly, "I trust you're finding the evening entertaining." "Quite," Victoria purred, though her amber eyes remained fixed on Arya with predatory intensity. "I was just getting acquainted with your new assistant." The pause before assistant was loaded with meaning, and several nearby conversations quieted as pack members strained to listen. Arya felt trapped between their expectations and the reality of her situation. Too close to the Alpha King for comfort, but not close enough for protection. Over the following days, the subtle harassment escalated. Arya's belongings disappeared from her new quarters and turned up in compromising locations. Nasty notes appeared under her door, questioning everything from her loyalty to her virtue. Someone spread rumors that she was using Omega pheromones to cloud the Alpha King's judgment. But the worst came during a pack gathering in the main hall. As Arya stood beside King Kale's chair during an important announcement about territory expansion, Lady Victoria rose from her seat with theatrical grace. "Alpha," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "The female members of the pack have been discussing recent changes in protocol. We're concerned about the message being sent when an Omega is elevated above her station." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Arya felt dozens of eyes boring into her, judging her, finding her lacking. "What message would that be, Lady Victoria?" King Kale's voice was dangerously quiet. "That rank and breeding no longer matter in the Silver Moon pack. That any female, regardless of bloodline or propriety, can seduce her way into positions of power." Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. Surely the Alpha King wouldn't want his people to think their leader could be so easily influenced. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Arya wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear back into the invisibility that had protected her for so long. But King Kale's response surprised everyone. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, his presence immediately commanding every breath in the room. "The Silver Moon pack has always valued loyalty, courage, and service above birth rank. Arya has proven herself in all 3 areas." His green eyes swept the crowd with unmistakable authority. "Anyone who questions my judgment in this matter is welcome to challenge me directly." The offer hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Challenging an Alpha King was tantamount to suicide unless you were absolutely certain you could win. And everyone in the hall knew King Kale had never lost a dominance fight. Victoria's smile faltered. "Of course, Alpha. I would never question your wisdom." But as the crowd dispersed, Arya caught the venomous looks directed her way by Lady Victoria and her supporters. She'd won this battle, but the war for acceptance was far from over. That night, as she walked through the palace corridors toward her quarters, The scent of conspiracy followed her like a shadow. Multiple wolves had been meeting in secret, their anger and frustration creating a toxic cloud that made her wolf whimper with unease. She paused outside her door, key in hand, when footsteps approached from behind. The scent was familiar, one of Lady Victoria's closest allies, a Gamma female named Elena whose jealousy burned like acid in the air. "Enjoy your elevation while it lasts, Omega," Elena whispered as she passed. "Even kings grow tired of their toys eventually." As Arya locked her door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her greatest danger wasn't coming from external enemies trying to kill King Kale. It was coming from the wolves who wanted to destroy her for daring to rise above her station. And unlike assassins with poisoned arrows, these enemies lived within the palace walls, smiled at her during daylight hours, and were growing bolder with each passing day. The festival of the full moon transformed the Silver Moon Pact territory into something from ancient legends. Massive bonfires blazed throughout the forest clearings, their flames reaching toward a moon so bright it cast everything in silver relief. Representatives from 12 allied packs had gathered for the celebration, over 300 werewolves whose combined presence made the very air thrum with supernatural energy. The scent of roasted meat, honey wine, and wild magic created an intoxicating cocktail that had even the most disciplined warriors relaxing their guard. Arya stood at the edge of the main ceremonial circle, trying to blend into the shadows despite her new position at King Kale's side. Her simple black dress, a concession to her elevated status, felt foreign against her skin, and the ornate silver pendant marking her as the Alpha King's personal aide seemed to weigh more than it should. Around the circle, pack leaders and their entourages arranged themselves according to ancient protocol. Each delegation wore their traditional colors and carried the ceremonial weapons that marked their lineage. The Crescent Moon Pack's banner fluttered in midnight blue and gold. The Iron Ridge Wolves displayed their silver and black with prideful precision. Even the smaller packs had come in force, their desire to maintain alliances overriding any concerns about showing weakness by attending in reduced numbers. But it was the Silver Moon Pack's display that truly commanded attention. King Kale stood at the circle's center, magnificent in his formal ceremonial clothing. His shirt was the deepest forest green, tailored to emphasize the powerful lines of his torso, while his black leather pants and boots spoke of both elegance and readiness for battle. The crown of his ancestors, a circlet of twisted silver and obsidian, caught the firelight and threw dancing shadows across his angular features. He looked every inch the Alpha King he was born to be, and Arya wasn't the only one who noticed. "Impressive showing," murmured Alpha Davidson of Crescent Moon, his gravelly voice carrying clearly in the crisp night air. "Kale certainly knows how to project strength. The question is whether it's genuine strength or mere theater," replied Alpha Morgan of the Iron Ridge Pack, her tone carefully neutral despite the provocative words. Arya's enhanced hearing caught every nuance of the political undercurrents flowing through the gathering. Alliance negotiations disguised as casual conversation, territorial disputes wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, and beneath it all, the constant assessment of power that determined survival in their world. But something else was threading through the crowd, something that made her wolf pace restlessly. "The ceremony will begin shortly," Fenric announced, his voice projecting across the entire gathering with practiced authority. As Beta, he served as the official herald for pack functions, and tonight he wore the role like a second skin. Arya studied him from across the circle, noting details that had become troubling over the past weeks. The way his blue eyes never quite met King Kale's directly anymore. The subtle tension in his shoulders when discussions turned to pack security. The faint scent of anxiety that clung to him despite his confident facade. And tonight, underneath the nervous energy that surrounded any major ceremony, she detected something else entirely. Anticipation that felt wrong, predatory. "Citizens of the allied packs," Fenric continued, raising his hands to command attention. "Tonight, under the light of our ancestor moon, Alpha King Kale will demonstrate the unity and strength of our alliance. The howl of dominance will carry across our territories, announcing to any who would challenge us that the Silver Moon Pack and her allies stand ready to defend what is ours. A cheer rose from the assembled crowd, hundreds of voices joining in approval. But the sound felt hollow to Arya, as if something essential was missing from the celebration. King Howl stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as a predator at the height of his power. Moonlight illuminated his face as he tilted his head back, preparing for the ancient ritual that would bind the allied packs together in symbolic unity. That's when the scent hit her. Metallic tang, sharp enough to make her stomach lurch. But this time it was stronger than before, layered with additional elements that made her wolf whimper in terror. Silver, yes, but also something organic and wrong, poison that had been refined, concentrated, made deadlier than anything she'd encountered. And underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of betrayal. Arya's gaze snapped to Fenric, who stood just outside the ceremonial circle with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was perfectly appropriate, respectful attention mixed with prideful satisfaction at his pack's display. But his scent told a different story entirely. Excitement, anticipation, and something that smelled horribly like satisfaction. "Begin the howl," Fenric called out, his voice carrying a note of encouragement that made Arya's blood run cold. Around the circle, pack representatives straightened to attention. This was the moment they'd all come to witness, the Alpha King's declaration of dominance that would echo through the forest and beyond, carrying to every supernatural creature within 50 miles. King Howl's chest expanded as he drew in the breath that would power his howl. In seconds, his voice would ring out across the territory with a power that would make the ancient trees tremble. The metallic scent spiked, becoming so strong that Arya could almost taste death on her tongue. Her enhanced senses screamed warnings that no one else could hear, painting a picture of horror about to unfold. Crossbows hidden in the tree-line, their silver-tipped bolts aimed with mathematical precision. Poison gas canisters concealed among the decorative elements, ready to release their deadly cargo the moment sound waves triggered their mechanisms. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, human assassins with weapons designed specifically to kill werewolves. All of it calibrated to activate the moment King Howl's howl reached its peak volume. "Don't do this," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the crowd's anticipatory murmur. King Howl's throat worked as he prepared to release the sound that would unite his allies and sign his death warrant. Arya looked around desperately, seeing 300 supernatural beings who had no idea they were about to witness their greatest ally's assassination. She saw Fenric's barely contained smirk as he watched his alpha prepare to die. She saw the visiting pack leaders, their faces bright with expectation. And she saw the exact moment when King Howl's lips parted to release his howl. Time slowed to a crystalline clarity that made every detail sharp as broken glass. The way moonlight caught on King Howl's crown, the expectant hush that fell over the crowd, the smell of death growing stronger with each passing second. Arya didn't think about the consequences, didn't consider how her actions would look to 300 witnesses, didn't calculate the political ramifications or her own survival odds. She simply moved. Her legs carried her forward with desperate speed, her Omega status forgotten in the face of absolute certainty. Gasps rose from the crowd as she burst from her position, but she barely heard them over the thundering of her own heartbeat. King Howl's green eyes widened as he saw her approach, confusion and something that might have been recognition flickering across his features. She threw herself forward just as his howl began to build in his chest, her body colliding with his as her voice rang out across the ceremonial circle with desperate authority. "Don't howl." The silence that followed was deafening. And in that silence, Arya heard the soft whistle of arrows that would have found their mark if King Howl had remained standing where protocol demanded. The festival of the full moon had just become a battlefield, and she had once again marked herself as either the pack's greatest protector or its most dangerous traitor. The ceremonial circle exploded into chaos. 300 supernatural beings erupted in voices of confusion, outrage, and barely contained violence. Pack leaders who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the sacred ceremony now watched in stunned disbelief as an Omega servant clung to their host's chest, having just disrupted the most important ritual in werewolf culture. "Seize her!" The command cracked through the night air like a whip. Fenric stepped into the circle with righteous fury blazing in his blue eyes, his hand already moving to the ceremonial blade at his hip. "This Omega has committed the highest blasphemy. She has sabotaged our sacred ceremony in front of our honored allies." A roar of agreement rose from several Silvermoon Pack members, their faces twisted with outrage. Around the circle, visiting pack leaders exchanged sharp glances, their expressions ranging from shocked confusion to calculating assessment of weakness within the Silvermoon hierarchy. "Execution!" someone shouted from the crowd. "She touched the Alpha King during the Howl." "Traitor!" another voice added, and soon a dozen pack members were calling for Arya's immediate death. Arya found herself pressed against King Kale's chest, his arms forming a protective barrier around her even as his own expression remained carefully neutral. She could feel the rapid beating of his heart, smell the conflict in his scent as he balanced political necessity against the growing certainty that she had once again saved his life. "Alpha Kale," called Alpha Davidson of Crescent Moon, his gravelly voice cutting through the chaos. "Perhaps you should explain why your servant felt entitled to interrupt our ceremony." The question carried layers of political implication. If King Kale couldn't control his own pack members, how could he be trusted to lead an alliance? If he allowed such disruption to go unpunished, what did that say about Silvermoon Pack discipline? Fenric seized on the opening with predatory satisfaction. "There is nothing to explain," he declared, moving closer with several warriors flanking him. "This Omega has repeatedly interfered with pack protocols. First the hunting ceremony, now this. The pattern is clear. She's working with our enemies to undermine Alpha Kale's authority." "That's not," Arya started, but Fenric cut her off with a slash of his hand. "Silence! You have no right to speak in this sacred circle." His voice carried the authority of his beta rank, and several pack members nodded in agreement. "Alpha, I demand permission to execute this traitor immediately. Every moment she breathes is an insult to our ancestors and our allies." The words sent ice through Arya's veins. Around the circle, she could see the political calculations playing out on various faces. Some pack leaders looked sympathetic to Fenric's position. Discipline and tradition were cornerstones of werewolf society. Others watched with the detached interest of predators evaluating whether the Silvermoon Pack was showing fatal weakness. But before King Kale could respond, Arya's enhanced senses caught something that made her wolf howl in terror. Movement in the treeline, the acrid smell of gunpowder and silver, human heartbeats racing with adrenaline and murderous intent. "There!" she shouted, breaking free from King Kale's protective embrace and pointing toward the forest's edge. 30 yards northeast, behind the oak cluster. 3 humans with crossbows, silver-tipped bolts already loaded. The crowd turned to follow her gesture, confusion replacing anger as they squinted into the darkness beyond the bonfire's reach. "She's trying to distract us," Fenric snarled, but something in his voice had changed. A note of desperation that only Arya's enhanced hearing could detect. "And there," she continued, her voice growing stronger as certainty built. 2 more in the pine grove to the west. They have some kind of gas canisters, poison designed to incapacitate wolves so the crossbows can finish the job." "Lies." Fenric stepped forward aggressively. "Alpha, don't let her manipulate." "Marcus." King Kale's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Take a team northeast. Thomas, check the western position. Now." The 2 warriors didn't hesitate, grabbing several pack members and disappearing into the forest with supernatural speed. The crowd fell silent except for the crackle of bonfires and the distant sound of pursuit through underbrush. Fenric's face had gone pale, But he pressed forward with his accusations. This proves nothing. She could have arranged for Confederates to be positioned there, ready to make her look like a hero when... His words cut off abruptly as Marcus's voice rang out from the forest. Got them. 3 humans exactly as described. Crossbows loaded with silver bolts, plus some kind of trigger mechanism that looks like it was designed to activate on sound. Moments later, Thomas's voice echoed from the western trees. 2 more here. They had poison gas canisters rigged to release when they heard the Alpha's howl. The silence that followed was electric with realization. Arya had been right again. The assassination attempt had been real, coordinated, and designed to activate at the exact moment of King Kale's ceremonial howl. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. The captured assassins were dragged into the ceremonial circle, their human sense mixing with fierce sweat and something else that made Arya's stomach clench with recognition. As they were forced to their knees before King Kale, one of them, a scarred man with cold gray eyes, lifted his head with defiant hatred. You can kill us, he spat, blood trickling from a split lip. But there are others. The Silver Moon Pack's days of dominance are numbered. Who sent you? King Kale's voice carried absolute authority, the kind of alpha presence that made even humans instinctively want to submit. The assassin's laugh was harsh, bitter. Someone who knows this pack's weaknesses better than you do, King. Someone who's been planning your death for months. Give me a name. Why should we? Another assassin interjected. We're dead either way. But our employer promised our families would be compensated when you finally fall. King Kale stepped closer, power radiating from him in waves that made even the visiting pack leaders shift nervously. Because if you cooperate, your deaths will be quick. If you don't. The threat hung in the air like a blade. Around the circle, 300 supernatural beings waited with predatory patience for information that could reshape the political landscape. The first assassin's resolve cracked. He said the beta would signal when the howl began. That was our cue to fire. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. Eyes turned toward Fenric, whose face had gone white as moonlight. He paid us half up front, the assassin continued, his voice growing stronger as he realized his words were weapons. Promised the rest when the job was done. Said he'd been feeding information to human hunter groups for months, setting up the perfect opportunity. What was his name? King Kale's voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. The assassin's gaze found Fenric across the circle, and his bloody smile was triumphant. Called himself Beta Fenric of the Silver Moon Pack. Said he was tired of serving a weak alpha who couldn't even protect his own mate. The words hit like a physical blow. Around the circle, pack members turned to stare at Fenric with expressions of shock, horror, and growing rage. The visiting pack leaders exchanged sharp glances, political calculations shifting as they realized they were witnessing the exposure of treason at the highest levels. Fenric stood frozen for a heartbeat, his face cycling through denial, anger, and something that looked almost like relief. Then his hand moved to his weapon with desperate speed. I should have killed you years ago, he snarled at King Kale, his mask of loyalty finally dropping completely. Sarah died because of your arrogance and you learned nothing. The pack deserves better than a king who... He never finished the sentence. King Kale moved with fluid violence, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion that spoke of a lifetime spent mastering the art of dominance. His hand clamped around Fenric's throat before the beta could draw his blade, lifting him off his feet with casual strength. You killed her, King Kale said quietly, and for the first time since Arya had known him, his perfect control cracked. The hunting accident. You arranged it. Fenric's laugh was choked but bitter. She was going to convince you to step down, to choose a peaceful path that would have made us weak. I couldn't let that happen. The confession sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Luna Sarah's death had been mourned throughout the allied packs. She'd been beloved for her wisdom and kindness. To learn it had been murder. You betrayed everything, King Kale continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. Your pack, your alpha, your oath of loyalty. I tried to save us, Fenric gasped, his feet dangling inches from the ground. From your weakness, from. But Arya was no longer listening to his justifications. Her enhanced senses had caught something else, the approach of more enemies through the forest, the acrid smell of weapons being prepared, the sound of coordinated movement that spoke of a larger plan still in motion. It's not over, she shouted, her voice carrying clearly through the circle. There are more of them coming. This was just the beginning. And as if summoned by her words, the forest around them exploded with the sound of battle cries and weapons fire. As Fenric's backup plan launched its assault on 300 of the most powerful supernatural beings in the region. The festival of the full moon had become a war zone, and the real fight was just beginning. The forest erupted in violence as dozens of human mercenaries emerged from concealment, their weapons glinting silver in the moonlight. But even as chaos exploded around the ceremonial circle, the most dangerous battle was about to unfold at its center. Fenric twisted in King Kale's grip with desperate strength, his hand finally closing around the ceremonial blade at his hip. The silver-blessed steel caught firelight as he drove it toward the Alpha King's exposed ribs, his face contorted with years of hidden rage and betrayal. King Kale released him just in time, the blade whistling past his chest by inches. Fenric landed in a crouch, immediately rolling away as the Alpha King's claws, half-shifted in fury, raked the ground where he'd been kneeling. You always were too trusting, Fenric snarled, circling with predatory grace despite the battle raging around them. Sarah tried to warn you. She said you'd never see betrayal coming from those closest to you. Don't speak her name. King Kale's voice was barely human, his green eyes beginning to glow with the wolf lurking just beneath his skin. You murdered my mate, you bastard. The two males began to circle each other in the ancient pattern of a dominance fight, their movement instinctively claiming the center of the ceremonial space despite the chaos surrounding them. Pack members from multiple territories pressed backward, forming a ring of witnesses even as human attackers engaged werewolf defenders in the forest beyond. Arya found herself trapped within that ring, too close to the violence but unable to escape through the press of bodies. Her enhanced senses were overloaded, the metallic taste of blood in the air, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the raw scent of two alphas preparing to fight to the death. Because that's what Fenric had become in his betrayal. No longer a beta serving his king, but an alpha challenger seeking to claim leadership through violence. She was weak, Fenric continued, his blade weaving hypnotic patterns as he spoke, always talking about peace, about finding diplomatic solutions to problems that required strength. She would have made you weak too, would have turned the Silver Moon pack into something soft and vulnerable. King Kale's response was a roar of pure rage that echoed across the battlefield, temporarily drowning out even the sounds of combat. His body began to shift, bones lengthening and muscles expanding as his wolf demanded release. But Fenric was ready for it. The treacherous beta lunged forward with inhuman speed, his silver blade aimed for King Kale's heart during the vulnerable seconds of transformation. It was a coward's move, striking an opponent mid-shift, but effective against even the strongest alpha. Kale! Arya screamed, her voice cutting through the night with desperate warning. King Kale twisted away from the killing blow, but not quickly enough. Fenric's blade opened a deep gash across his ribs, silver-burning werewolf flesh as blood began to flow freely. The scent of it made every wolf in the vicinity snarl with aggressive response. First blood to me, Fenric said with savage satisfaction. Just like when I put that arrow through Sarah's heart. The confession hit like a physical blow. Around the circle, gasps of horror rose from pack members who had believed Lunacera's death was a tragic accident. Even the visiting pack leaders recoiled at such calculated betrayal. But King Kale used their shock as cover, his partial transformation completing in a burst of supernatural power. He was magnificent and terrifying in his hybrid form, 8 feet of muscle and fury, claws like razors and fangs capable of crushing bone. Fenric backpedaled quickly, but his own wolf was rising to meet the challenge. The beta had always been large for his rank, and his hybrid form was nearly as imposing as his king's. They collided in the center of the circle with the sound of thunder. Claws raked across flesh. Fangs sought vulnerable throats. Ancient werewolf instincts guided their movements as they fought with a brutality that made even seasoned warriors step back in awe. But Fenric still had advantages: the silver blade that could inflict wounds that wouldn't heal quickly, and the desperate cunning of someone with nothing left to lose. As they grappled for dominance, Fenric managed to drive his knee into King Kale's wounded ribs, sending fresh blood flowing. The Alpha King's grip loosened momentarily, and Fenric used the opening to break free and create distance. "You never deserved to be king," Fenric gasped, his own body marked with deep claw wounds that leaked crimson onto the ceremonial ground. "The pack follows you out of fear, not respect. When you're dead, they'll thank me for freeing them." "They'll spit on your grave," King Kale replied, but Arya could see the silver poisoning was beginning to affect him. His movements were slightly slower, his breathing labored. Fenric saw it too, and his confidence returned with vicious intensity. "I'll make sure they understand you died because of your weakness, because you trusted an Omega servant over your own beta." His gaze found Arya across the circle, and the hatred in his eyes made her blood freeze. "But first, I'll kill the little bitch who ruined everything." Fenric moved with shocking speed, not toward King Kale but toward Arya, his silver blade raised for a killing strike. His strategy was brutal but effective: force the Alpha King to choose between his own survival and protecting someone he'd grown to value. Arya had no time to run, no weapons to defend herself, no training in combat that could save her from a fully shifted beta werewolf intent on murder. She could only stand frozen as death approached in the form of glittering steel. But her mind was still working, still cataloging details with the enhanced senses that had made her valuable. Fenric's approach angle, the way his weight shifted as he committed to the attack, the split second when he would be most vulnerable. As Fenric closed the final distance, Arya did the only thing she could think of. She dropped to the ground and rolled sideways, not away from the attack but directly into Fenric's path. Her unexpected movement caught him off guard, sending him stumbling as he tried to adjust his strike. It bought her perhaps 2 seconds, not enough to escape, but enough for King Kale to cross the space between them. The Alpha King's claws caught Fenric in the back, puncturing vital organs with surgical precision. But the treacherous beta had one last desperate gambit. He twisted as he fell, bringing his silver blade around in a final strike aimed at King Kale's throat. Time seemed to slow as the weapon arced toward its target. Arya saw the moment when King Kale realized he couldn't dodge completely, saw him shift to take the wound in his shoulder rather than his neck. But she also saw something else. A small stone within reach, kicked loose during the fighting. Without thinking, she grabbed the stone and hurled it with all her strength at Fenric's wrist. The impact wasn't enough to stop the attack, but it deflected the blade just enough to save King Kale's life. Instead of piercing his throat, the silver steel grazed across his collarbone, leaving a burning wound but nothing fatal. King Kale's response was immediate and final. His fangs found Fenric's throat, and the traitor's last sound was a gurgle of surprise as the Alpha King's jaws closed with crushing force. The silence that followed was profound. Slowly, King Kale released his grip and stepped back, blood dripping from multiple wounds but alive and victorious. Around the circle, 300 supernatural beings stared at the scene with expressions of awe, horror, and grudging respect. The sounds of battle from the forest were fading as well. Human mercenaries were no match for coordinated werewolf packs once the element of surprise was lost. "It's finished," King Kale said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite his wounds. "The traitor is dead. The threat is ended." One by one, pack members began to kneel. First the Silver Moon wolves, Then the visiting delegations, all acknowledging the Alpha King's right to rule through strength and justice. But it was Alpha Davidson of Crescent Moon who spoke the words that mattered most. The alliance stands stronger than before, and all present have witnessed that the Silver Moon Pack is led by a true Alpha, one who protects his own and punishes betrayal without mercy. As King Kale nodded acknowledgement of the tribute, his eyes found Arya across the circle. She was still kneeling where she'd fallen, shaking with reaction and adrenaline but alive. Their gazes held for a long moment, and in his green eyes she saw something that made her heart race with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Recognition, respect, and something deeper that looked almost like. The thought was too dangerous to complete, but as the pack began to disperse and tend to their wounded, Arya knew that everything had changed. She was no longer invisible. For better or worse, she had stepped fully into the light. 3 days after the festival of the full moon became a battlefield, the Silver Moon Pack territory had returned to something resembling normal. The visiting allies had departed with newfound respect for their host's strength and justice. The dead had been buried with appropriate ceremony, though Fenric's grave remained unmarked, his name struck from pack records as if he had never existed. And in the great hall where pack meetings had been held for generations, King Kale stood before his assembled people with an announcement that would reshape their understanding of hierarchy forever. The events of the festival have proven beyond doubt that loyalty and courage matter more than bloodline or birth rank, he declared, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the vast space. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of pack members who ranged from excited supporters to skeptical traditionalists. Arya stood to his right, no longer trying to blend into shadows but still struggling to accept her place in the light. The simple blue dress she wore marked her as more than a servant but less than nobility, a visual representation of her unique position within the pack structure. Arya of the Silver Moon Pack, King Kale continued, turning toward her with an expression of formal gravity, has twice saved my life through her enhanced abilities and quick thinking. She has proven her loyalty not through words but through actions that place my safety above her own. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the crowd, though Arya's enhanced hearing caught the whispered comments that not everyone was entirely pleased with this development. She's still just an Omega, someone murmured near the back. Enhanced senses don't change breeding, added another voice, too quiet for normal hearing but clear as daylight to Arya. King Kale either didn't hear the whispers or chose to ignore them. Therefore, I name Arya as my official advisor and protector, with all rights and privileges that position entails. She will stand at my side during pack business, accompany me to diplomatic meetings, and her counsel will be sought on matters of security and pack welfare. The formal declaration sent another wave of reaction through the assembled wolves. This time, however, the responses were more varied. Marcus stepped forward first, dropping to one knee in a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about his assessment of Arya's contributions. The pack honors your wisdom, Alpha, he said clearly, and his acceptance seemed to give others permission to follow suit. One by one, pack members began to kneel, not the forced submission of conquered enemies, but the willing acknowledgement of earned respect. Thomas joined Marcus on the floor. Several Gamma warriors followed. Even some of the kitchen staff who had worked alongside Arya for years offered tentative smiles and nods of approval. But not everyone was convinced. Lady Victoria remained standing near the far wall, her amber eyes cold with barely contained resentment. Around her, a small cluster of high-ranking females maintained similarly rigid postures, their disapproval radiating like heat from a forge. The pack recognizes your new status, Victoria said when the formal ceremony concluded, approaching Arya with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How unexpected your rise has been, Lady Victoria, Arya replied carefully, having learned that direct confrontation with established pack hierarchy was rarely wise, regardless of her new position. I'm sure you'll find your new responsibilities quite challenging, Victoria continued, her tone suggesting she hoped those challenges would prove overwhelming. Managing an Alpha King's affairs requires skills that aren't typically developed in the kitchens. Before Arya could respond, King Kale appeared at her side with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Lady Victoria," he said pleasantly, though something in his green eyes made the beta female take an involuntary step backward. "I trust you'll extend Arya the same courtesy you would show any member of my inner circle." It wasn't really a request, and Victoria's forced smile acknowledged the implicit command. "Of course, Alpha. I would never dream of showing disrespect to your advisor." After the formal ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, King Kale led Arya to his private study, the same room where he had first tested her abilities and discovered the depth of Fenric's betrayal. But now it felt different, less like an interrogation chamber and more like a sanctuary where they could speak freely. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling into his chair while gesturing for her to take the seat across from him. Not the subservient position she'd occupied during their first meeting, but an arrangement between equals. "Terrifying," Arya admitted honestly. 3 weeks ago I was invisible. Now half the pack watches my every move, waiting for me to fail. And the other half?" She considered the question carefully. "The other half seems willing to give me a chance to prove myself." "That's more than I ever expected." King Kale leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You saved my life twice, Arya. You helped expose a traitor who had been planning my death for months. You've earned more than a chance. You've earned a place at my side." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But Arya felt something shift in the space between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that extended far beyond professional partnerships. "I never thanked you properly," he continued, his voice softer now, more personal, "for seeing what no one else could see, for having the courage to act when action meant risking everything." "You gave me a purpose," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere." A month later, as the next full moon rose over the Silver Moon Pact territory, everything had changed. The monthly ceremony took place in the same ceremonial circle where chaos had erupted during the festival, but now the space felt cleansed, purified by justice served and truth revealed. Pact members gathered with genuine anticipation rather than political obligation, their faces bright with renewed faith in their leadership. King Kale stood in the center of the circle, magnificent in his ceremonial clothing and the crown of his ancestors. But this time, before raising his head to begin the ancient ritual, he turned toward the edge of the circle where Arya waited. Their eyes met across the sacred space, and she saw the question in his gaze. Not the desperate plea of their first encounter, but the respectful inquiry of someone seeking counsel from a trusted advisor. She studied the night with senses that had once marked her as different but now made her invaluable. The air was clean, free of the metallic tang of danger. The forest held only the natural sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. Her wolf was calm, content, sensing no threats to disturb the sacred ceremony. Arya smiled and nodded once, a small gesture that spoke volumes about trust, partnership, and the unshakable bond that had formed between an Alpha King and the Omega who had dared to save his life. Only then did King Kale tilt his head back and release his howl into the night. The sound that emerged was pure power, primal music that echoed through the ancient trees and announced to the world that the Silver Moon Pact was stronger than ever. It spoke of unity restored, justice served, and leadership that had been tested by betrayal and emerged more powerful than before. As the last notes faded into the darkness, Arya stood straighter, no longer the frightened servant who had once hidden in shadows. She was the Alpha King's trusted advisor, his protector, his partner in leading their people toward a future built on merit rather than birthright. And as King Kale's gaze found hers again in the moonlight, she saw in his green eyes the promise of possibilities that extended far beyond duty and protection, possibilities that would unfold in their own time, when they were both ready to embrace what fate had always intended. The invisible Omega had become the guardian of kings, and her story was just beginning.